Welcome to Making Worlds, conversations about imagining otherwise. I'm Hannah McGregor, and on this show, I talk to cool people about fantasy, sci-fi, speculative fiction, magical realism, and other genres that let us envision different possibilities for how the world could be. This episode is a best of, meaning that Gaby, our editor extraordinaire, picked some of the best moments of Making Worlds from the last season. From talking about how I Think You Should Leave is actually fantasy, to the transformative power of musical theater, to discussing how we all realized we were gay during the pandemic, this show has explored so much. This best of is part of another important announcement, which is that Making Worlds in its current form is going on hiatus. The Witch Please team has decided to focus our collective energy on our flagship show, Material Girls. We have loved making this show and discussing how we can imagine otherwise with all of our wonderful guests. It's been such a joy for all of us to work on this project together. We will still release episodes of Making Worlds to our Patreon in the future when we have creative spark and capacity as a team. In fact, we already have one in the hopper about the radical, fantastical world of queer romance. So look out for an upcoming opportunity to unlock that as a bonus. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy this trip down memory lane. My second question is about how this show helps you show up in the world differently, how it's helped you, or maybe helped fans of the show in general, imagine the world otherwise. So talk to me about the impact of this show.
It's like such a big question because I came really prepared to talk about the macro. So I am ready to talk about that. But on the micro level, I actually had an essay published about how much it affected me, which was on Catapult. And that essay was, I'm not sending people there. That site has folded, although I think there's an archival post up about it. For me personally, it was like, the first season especially like really moved me because it was sort of surprising to watch in real time. People who like me started watching it because it was funny and a sitcom, maybe didn't expect the sort of gut punch of romance in the last 3 episodes. It wasn't advertised that way. HBO didn't do like an LGBTQ week, our flag means death. It really was under the radar in that way. And so the romance between Steed and Blackbeard in the first season really moved me. And I was sort of like, I had a relationship that I don't think I would have had with someone that I was like, you know what, if they're the gold standard, this is what I deserve. And so like that, that affected me on that level, but I think my own stuff is slightly less interesting to me than in how it's interacted with the fans that I see and am a part of on the internet, because I think it came in March 2022 was the first season, and the whole first season aired in March 2022, and the whole second season aired in October 2023. And I think in that time, that's the end of the the end of the second year of the pandemic into the beginning of the fourth year, basically. And for people who, I know we're all like kind of back in a way, everyone's kind of back in their lives, maybe the way they were, but I don't think there's a lot of media yet that's responded to that collective trauma and the way that a lot of people really were disillusioned with their conventional lives during that time. And I think people who knew that it was all a lie could probably come to the show from that point of view. But then there are people who are like slowly realizing it. And what I mean is, the idea that your job.
Oh yeah. Okay. What's the it that's all a lie?
I mean, I actually am going to go further, but I would say like for some people, it was their job, the recognition that like their job wanted them to work at the cost of their own health and their life, which was always true, but became really like, undeniable in the last few years. And then for some people, a lot of marriages fell apart during the pandemic because of sort of a million things, right? But like unrealistic expectations of women to keep the home sort of running in the midst of all that, which then began to include children, like homeschooling kids that were never intended to be homeschooled, and, watching what their husbands actually did and maybe realizing that they don't work harder than them. They just leave their work at work and then expect to rest when it's domestic labor time. Yeah. That was like something that was written about pretty widely and also I think observed in our own lives. So I think that was something that happened to a lot of people. And there's all these articles from the last few years about how many more people came out as queer during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And had some gender revelations.
100%. Yes, queerness broadly, as in same-sex attraction and in gender, revelations. And I think like part of that was the amount of time you were spending with your own thoughts and people not being able to deny those things anymore. But I think part of it also was spending really intense, intimate time with media in place of real people. And so, I do think that there were people I know. For me, I know like anecdotally at least three. I had two friends who had considered themselves like gold star lesbians who were like, I'm very confused by my attraction to Taika Waititi as Blackbeard.
Yeah.
And then I had a married guy friend who had considered himself straight and was like, I'm very confused by my sexual attraction to Taika Waititi as Blackbeard.
Oh, Taika Waititi
sexually
confusing us all. So beyond just really liking Dimension 20 and finding it very comforting and funny and sweet and all of these things we love about it, what about it lets you imagine the world otherwise? What's the sort of radical potential in this for you?
I just think that there's something, I guess it's an uncanniness about Dimension 20 and about actual play and TTRPG shows where you can mash together a complete fantasy and complete, not just high fantasy where it's like elves and dragons, but complete ridiculousness against the sort of political constructs and things that touch a little bit too close to home. And the only way that it's comfortable at times to explore that is by having it alongside things that are completely ridiculous. So in Dimension 20, one of the anthology pieces that stands out to me is A Crown of Candy, which is a sort of Game of Thrones, really, really, really rough exploration of like feudal values and really horrendous,
and like the violence of religion,
the violence of like kings and queens and all of that rule, but the characters are all made out of candy and food.
It's Game of Thrones set in Candyland.
The only way that like certain character deaths and like actions are bearable is because it's gummy bear people. And like the only way that certain betrayals are bearable is because it's chocolate people.
Brennan ends one of his villains' monologue by saying, "And this is a piece of cake." And then that piece of cake stabs another character.
It's only bearable because of that. It's only fundamentally bearable because of that. Or getting to explore like the vicissitudes of corporate America through the ridiculousness of the underbelly of a magical world in New York.
Yeah, the fantastical tropes take things that are real and urgent and pressing and sets them slightly at a distance so that we can like look at them and think about them and talk about them, but not feel just totally crushed by them. Because that is a thing about Dimension 20 is that the players joke that like in Brennan's stories, the bad guy is always capitalism or the church. But like they are explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-oppressive narratives that are using their different worlds that they jump into always to think about and critique power.
If I was going to pick like one overarching theme that I'm kind of obsessed with in this series, it's really kind of like the costs and the price of survival, right? Because the intimacy with death, the materiality with death, the fact that we've got a magical system that works with death means that survival is possible in all of these ways that, like, frankly, I don't think I've ever seen in another series. Like, there's so many different ways that this manifests, up to and including the survival of the planet Earth herself, right? But also, Taz really just makes you sit with like, this comes at a huge cost and not everybody survives even if they're still technically alive, right? What is it to be like haunting your own body post an unimaginable loss, right? What is it to know that your existence cost the death of thousands? And what kind of responsibilities does that dump on you that you never signed up for? What is it to be in a universe where God can and can't die? multiple times. And what happens when you can't kill God and God's getting it wrong?
What do you do when you get to the center of power and you realize that that power is neither perfectly good nor perfectly evil, but just as complicated and messy as any other human you've ever encountered?
Messy, but again, like inescapable,
Yeah.
incontrovertible.
Yeah.
I really, there are just so many moments in this book where you're like, okay, this is going to be sorted and things are going to be better now. Which, as someone who has been sitting in a deep pool, a saltwater pool of grief for at least the last year, I absolutely get the longing for that. Like, okay, this is the moment and it sucked, but we're going to get past it. And it just keeps being complicated and bigger every time we zoom out. And so I'm both finding myself really excited for the final book, Elect of the Ninth, but like also, oh no, like what horrors are we going to be visited upon, like are going to be visited upon us now? What other horrible ways am I going to have to think about, again, like survival and human existence?
I want to draw some connections between this conversation about imagining other models of motherhood and the conversation about empire and bodies being used up by empire. Because, when we think about motherhood as an inherently oppressive structure, which I think sometimes in feminist conversations, certainly we do, that's a version of motherhood that is attached particularly to like white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal society, right? So there's also this imagining otherwise that happens in sci-fi and speculative fiction and fantasy that lets us see that ideas like motherhood can be divorced from or like prized apart from a lot of our like Western imperial assumptions and themselves imagined otherwise.
I think that's very true. And I think one of the so there's many great tensions about mothering, right? And I find it really funny that I wanted to have this conversation because famously this conversations about parenting and mothering aren't actually terribly interesting to me. But which again is part of what being squashed into the mold of motherhood. I was just like, I can't care about these things the way the world wants me to care about them, which is part of why I find the representations in ancillary justice so interesting, because Breck also doesn't care about performing performing anything in a way that the Ratch finds acceptable. She's abandoned that. And so one of the key tensions in being a mother in North America is this tension between whether it's the best thing you can do or the worst thing you can do.
It's both. It's the only acceptable thing to do as a woman and the most denigrated category in our society.
Yes, it is both of those things. And so it is a true damned if you do, damned if you don't moment. And by prying open the idea that it might be a really valuable job.
Yep.
But not like a sanctified job, the way I think a lot of movements, like the trad wife movement and things like that, may encourage folks to think that it is this, sanctified is no other word for it, where there's this idea of holding my hands up, but this idea of motherhood, which is something that I don't fit. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. I really love my kids. I love hanging out with them and I love being a good person, but not those things can all fit into many, many different forms of caretaking and community building that are not me like building a human inside my body and then giving birth to it,
So can we talk a little bit more about the particular fandom of Black magical girls?
Yeah, it's something I stumbled into when I first started getting on TikTok during the pandemic. I found like a lot more of like Black anime community on TikTok, which was like really nice, especially during the pandemic. Because growing up, I grew up in like on the west side of Washington, like in like predominantly white schools. It was definitely kind of like, not only was anime not like popular, but like finding Black kids who are also into anime was like super rare, especially outside of my family. And so just like finding that like community on TikTok was like amazing. And then Black Magical Girls, it's still growing. There's like stuff here and there and like mostly like indie projects, and you can't really blame it because most of it Magical Girl stuff is from Japan, and which is like a homogenous culture. But like there's definitely like a growing kind of like movement of like Black girls like cosplaying magical girls and starting their own like indie projects involving like magical girls.
Can you tell me a little bit more about like what those indie projects might look like?
Yeah, so my favorite one, it's Magical Melody. She's also a Seattle native. So basically, she like writes and directs like her own like magical girl show, and like she has like her friends and like her boyfriend playing like the different characters in the magical girl show, and it's definitely like '90s like magical girl like inspired. So like lot of soft aesthetics, a lot of like soft music playing. It's very fun though. Very fun.
I love that. And it is so interesting because as you pointed out, Japanese culture can be really homogeneous. And I think that there is quite a lot of anti-blackness in Japan as well. And so this sort of taking up those aesthetics and repurposing them as, a celebration and also like a fan practice of remaking um feels so so joyful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's also nice because like as like Black women, like often like our femininity is often like discounted or we're seen through like a more like masculine lens. And so like kind of like reclaiming the magical girl like aesthetic, which is like hyper feminine, is like another way to like, empower my own like femininity.
But I'm thinking about that letter and the way it stands in contrast to Bill and Frank's final day together. So the way that their story ends is that Frank has, I think, MS is the implication, but some sort of degenerative illness that is making him, he can't use his hands for the most part. He's using a wheelchair. He needs a lot of physical assistance to get around. And Bill is doing all of this physical work like lovingly and patiently and gently. And Frank makes the decision. He's like, I don't like, there's no cure for this. I have lived a life that has been so much better than anything I could have expected in this terrible, terrible zombie filled world. I'm ready to die. And so he tells Bill what he wants his last day to be. And that oh no, I'm gonna cry. And that
It's
he
okay,
wants
I'm already
them to,
crying.
and that he wants them to go and put on nice clothes and get married on their last day together. It's fine. Everybody's fine.
And the thing about their marriage is that it's just the two of them. It's not like it's in front of anybody. It's just that it's just a symbolic thing that they do just for each other.
Yeah. And Bill gets really upset at this, right? Being, his partner asking him to kill him. And Frank says, I need you to love me in the way I want to be loved. And that is like, yeah, okay, then he writes a letter that's like, the thing that we actually have to offer is guns. But like, that's not what he gave Frank. Our usefulness is guns.
I've got a truck.
Got a truck. But that's not what he does for Frank in that last day. He loves Frank the way Frank wants to be loved.
Yeah, which is a process of ceremony and symbols and really, really relishing what it means to be alive and together to the absolute capacity that they can. Yeah.
We made all of us cry. Viewers, you can't see, but Zoe is also crying. You are immersed in a deep rewatch of this show, and I want to talk about how the kind of liberatory possibilities that Star Trek The Next Generation models are showing up for you in your own lives.
I think for me, it is maybe a little bit more the other way around, where there's like a lot of the kind of values and the way that like I live my life that I see showing up in um the next generation, where it's like, you know, there is an importance, there's like a heavy importance on like interpersonal relationships and sort of like the way that we're kind of all in this together, and how, you know, having a community for like around a common goal like is really like a strength, and like problem solving together, and problem solving sort of in a way that's not selfish, and sort of keeping an eye on like, well, what is a sort of greater good, like capital G, greater good. It's like honestly just really, it's like refreshing, but also just it's nice to see a future where that is working. I guess like it's really easy right now to just be like, wow, we are just barreling headfirst into an Octavia Butler future.
I hate
Into
barreling headfirst into Octavia Butler.
Yeah, it's really funny. We're recording on, what is it, the 18th or the 19th? Parable of the Sower starts like July 20th, 2024. That's like the first entry of the book.
I started reading Parable of the Sower recently and was like,
yeah, the fact that she wrote this in like the late 80s, early 90s is like mind-boggling, because you're just like, how did you so aptly predict what was going to happen right now? And even in that book, it is about sort of the importance of empathy and coming together, and sort of having a clear eye, a clear vision of like what is happening now, and how we can, as people, can come together in order to survive. And even in Parable of the Sower, it's like sort of the end result. It's like take root amongst the stars is sort of like the overarching, or like one of the goals of like one of the themes like throughout the book, that the main character is like, you know, it's like survival, like to like, you know, empathy, togetherness, but also we can move beyond this planet and be something else, and kind of be of the universe. So I think seeing this sort of like seeing that people like seeing humanity have survived, surviving in a future where everyone acknowledges, like even the first episodes, like, yeah, humanity, we almost just went to war and just almost completely went extinct, but we pulled through and came out the other side to a place where we are in a post-scarcity society, where like humanity still continues as a species, and has, they're always like, you know, we're not warring anymore, which isn't totally true, but it's a different kind of warring. We're not warring amongst each other over minute bullshit, essentially.
Lark, what about you? How do you experience the sort of liberatory possibilities of this show?
I mean, I think a lot of what Jesse talked about is the same for me. One of the things that, like, on a much smaller scale that I think about a lot is kind of what we were talking about earlier with Star Trek's relationship to masculinity. Like, as a trans man, thinking about how I want to be in the world, and like learning to become comfortable using the word man to describe myself instead of being like trans masculine, because like that word carries with it a lot of things that I don't particularly like. And so I feel like when I'm sitting with that, the thing that I consistently turn to is Star Trek. And I'm like, this is what masculinity can be. And that's the kind that that's the kind that I'm going to associate that word with for myself.
There's something about the actual creation of the show for me that I really love, and speaks to like both how I see the world, but also how I think about creation, how I think about collaboration, all of those things. Like, it's this extremely lovely group of people that the creators, Zach Kanan and Tim Robinson, pull together. And it also is a show that for me it really exemplifies punching up while still being extremely funny. And it's not like it's doing a reversal. I was talking to our mutual friend, Megan, about this. And she said that it's not even like about subverting or making fun of like the jock or doing something, or these guys are like nerds that are triumphing. Like, it has nothing to do with that. It's literally just about addressing people's like bad behavior.
You're right, because it's not types. It's not like, oh,
It's
you know,
not at
this
all.
type.
It's
like,
not at all.
that's not a type.
No, that's, I guess, too, like, speaking of sort of the larger world of it, like, none of these people are types. They are the most singular weirdos that you will ever encounter. And I think that to me also speaks to just the world I want to live in. Like, you know, thinking about even the concept of like jocks or whatever, like those people don't even exist in this world. Like, we are just living in a world where everyone is kind of allowed to embrace their absolute strangest desire or be free with the mistakes they have made too. Like, there are so many failures in this show. There are so many mistakes that people make. And on one level, there's like just kind of an assumption that, like in real life, people make mistakes and do these things, and they just get to like, yes, there are some kinds of consequences, but they get to continue living and like experiencing the world.
Yeah, that it isn't like, it's like you can be the nastiest, weirdest little freak who fucks up in the most possible ways, and the consequence is like your mom comes to pick you up from the adult haunted house tour and you didn't make any friends again.
You made no friends.
You made no friends.
You made no friends.
No. But like, there's no level of freaky little weirdo, socially awkward, outcast, absolute human fuck up that you can be in this series that excludes you. And that is cathartic, isn't it? It's thinking about this show as a world building project. It's so interesting the way the world building that happens within the actual fantastical world of Steven Universe mirrors so much of the kind of creative world that Rebecca Sugar was building, that is also a kind of world building to create a collaborative artistic space in which people can show up as themselves, in which, you know, like, in which you're deeply humane and treat people as humans. And it is also present in both the show and I think in the story of the show's creation, that at some point, if you are going to protect the people you care about from the violence of the world, bad things might happen to you. And that's part of the sad thing of it too, right? Is like, it was very, very hard for her to make this show.
Yeah. So, you know, over the course of this show, she realized that she came out as non-binary and bisexual. She's been really open in interviews that for a really long time, she didn't understand how important it was to her that those pieces of her identity like be acknowledged, not only acknowledged, but like celebrated, because she had been told for so long, oh, it doesn't matter that you feel this way. Like, you're so talented. Like, it was sort of almost presented to her as if it was like, don't worry about your deviance because you're so great at just like, you're so charming and so
the Oscar Wilde of cartoonists.
So talented. And she was like, you know, after you make hundreds of episodes of something on this topic, you kind of start to realize, oh, actually this bothered me that I didn't see this representation. And she's also been very open about like the standards and practices notes that she got on any time she was trying to do queer representation, and like how hard she had to fight for that to eventually happen later in the show, and like the mental health toll of that. So we know that, as you know, she created this beautiful space for other people, she was absorbing a lot of damage from forces outside who now acknowledge that what she did was incredible. And they basically, when they have meetings, like Ian Jones Cordy, now her husband, but also a
sort of brainstormer and producer on the show, has said, like, I go into development meetings now and they basically describe Steven Universe as the show they want people to be making, right? Like this show that they had to fight so hard to make. They're like, well, we want it to like be for boys, but also appeal to teens and tweens and maybe adults, and also have an extensive lore. And maybe there's like some diverse queer characters in it. That's the kind of show we're looking for, right? And it's like, it was such a tall order to pitch this thing, right? And to like get it made. And there were so many, Rebecca Sugar had to really go to bat to do what she wanted to do in the 5 original seasons of this show. And so it's really interesting to me that in future, Steven Universe Future, and even the movie to a certain extent, she then explores like the cost of being yourself, or the cost, like, and that, so it's like, even as the show is really optimistic, there is sort of like there's a price to that when you live in a world that can often be really mean, right?
I, like most people my young age, I'm 25, by the way.
Yeah, a little baby.
I'm a little baby. I'm 25. Grew up with Harry Potter fan fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the first fanfic I ever read and engaged with was Castle. Did anyone ever watch Castle?
I absolutely watched Castle.
I read some Castle fanfic back in the day, and that kind of like opened that, plus anything else that I could get my hands on kind of opened my eyes to the fact that the story doesn't have to end after you turn the TV off or you finish the book or whatever. So I went through a phase in my teens when I might have been like very early teens, where I was on Tumblr all the time. I was reading fanfic. I was also very Catholic, so I would feel guilty after I read anything that was remotely horny. And then I would be like, okay, well, no more of that. Because being horny sends you to jail.
Being horny does send you to jail. Yeah.
So then I grew up. I grew up and I became a slut. No, I'm just kidding. I grew up and I was like, I'm not Catholic anymore. And it doesn't seem like Catholicism and fan fiction should be linked, but to me they were, because I was able to let go of a lot of the guilt that was associated with consuming stuff that wasn't canon. Because to me, I was like, I'm ruining, if I read something smutty or out of character, I'm tainting the experience that I have with this media that I love, the original media. And again, then I grew up and was like, no, I'm not. So I got back into it in a big way a couple years ago. I was really big on Succession. I'm going to say I read and I wrote a lot of Succession fan fiction.
You wrote Succession fan fiction. What happens in your Succession fan fiction?
It's sex. They have sex.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the Phantom's role has changed in my life since I've gotten older, for sure. Like, because I really identified with wanting to be the ingenue. And in like singing and especially opera, there, like, once you turn 30, you're no longer like a young artist or like so you go into crone territory essentially. So I'm like on the cusp of crone territory in the opera world. I guess it's kind of like depressing, because when I was in like the opera program, I like really wanted, like I was waiting for that moment when I was going to be discovered, because I was always in the chorus, never got a shot, and I was like really pretty in the background, or a very pretty piece of furniture, so to speak. And I was like, I really want this to happen for me. Like, it could happen for me. And there's this, like, even like in opera school, it's like the professors would say, oh, you never know what's going to happen. Like, you could suddenly have access to your upper register. Like, something could change for you vocally, and suddenly you have this like amazing instrument at your fingertips. So it's kind of like this weird, because like when you're young, like your voice doesn't really mature until you're like 25. So when, all of us little guys in the opera program, like at 21 or 19 or 21, you're like, maybe I'll be something really cool. That dream of being that ingenue started with Phantom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I definitely lived through realizing that was not going to happen for me. And it was very painful. Yeah. But now I think I look at Phantom just as something that changed my life. Like, it's not so much like the contents of it, but it's like the role that it played in my life of making me go into opera and making me love singing.
Yeah,
so it's not so much the world that it's creating. It's like
it's the world that it created for you. And that's such a major part of how texts that matter to us show up in our lives, is like, there's no text or story or work of art out there that in itself carries the latent ability to change somebody. It's an interaction between art and human that sort of creates that transformation. So it's like, this is a piece of art that you encountered, and that totally changed, like, made a different world for you. A world that, like, opened out this art form that, like, otherwise you might not have encountered. Making Worlds is a Witch Please production. Thank you to our amazing patrons for making this show and Material Girls possible. If you want more Witch Please Productions content, head over to our website at ohwitchplease.ca to access transcripts, reading lists, and merch. We also have a whole other show called Gender Playground that is hosted by Marcel Cosman and Rami Marks. Gender Playground is a podcast that is dedicated to the joys of gender-affirming care for kids, and you can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads, for now, at Oh Witch Please, and on TikTok, for now, at Oh Witch Please Pod. We also have a Substack, for now, where you can read our monthly newsletter, The Monthly Hoot, and special behind-the-episode content, and we can all fantasize about a world where all social media isn't run by crooks. A special thank you to the folks behind the scenes: producer Zoe Mix, associate producer and editor Gaby Iori, executive producer Hannah Rehak, aka Coach, and Marcel Cosman, co-founder of Witch Please Productions. Thanks to Jay Arner and Jessica Delisle, who wrote our beautiful theme song, and to Zoe Mix for designing the Making Worlds logo. And thank you to all of our guests over the last season. You have made this show so special. And finally, thank you to our viewers. Thanks for imagining otherwise with us.